Hey everyone, welcome to economics recording for lesson unit 13, which is lesson 61 through 65. And the topics for this unit are going to be the following: medical insurance and all the aspects of that, Social Security, so you guys have a better understanding of what all goes into retirement and how you will be paying for that over your lifetime, Medicare and Medicaid, and the purpose of those for the elderly and those with low income, and how they can still get medical care because of that. And then energy sources and how that has impacted our economy over the different centuries, how our industry has changed due to what those sources are, and auto manufacturing, how that has changed over time in the United States, and what those changes mean for our economy. And then lastly, the last topic is mortgages and how that how that has changed over time as well, and what it looks like now, and why things are the way they are in that industry. So to start off with, we're going to go through and discuss insurance first. So first and foremost, insurance is something in which it allows you to share the risk of expense. So what that means is, if I am to, let's just say for car insurance, total my car, I don't have any money to buy that same type of car, the same value of car, I guess. If it was a 10 grand car, just totaled it, I don't have the resources to replace that car that's $10,000. So if you have full coverage on the car, the insurance company will say, here's the money because you've paid us a monthly rate to ensure you have this full coverage year after year. We're going to pay that money back to you and allow you to buy that $10,000 or whatever the value of that car was, 10 grand, even though you don't have that in the bank. So the insurance company literally writes you a check for that. So here's the thing: some people can go all their life and never have a wreck, although they're paying insurance in case they do. So all the money for the people who aren't getting into wrecks are going to those who are getting wrecks, getting into accidents and having wrecks, and having, insurance pay the cost of that. So in the end, you are sharing the cost, the expenses of other people's other people's costs, and that sharing that cost allows individuals as a whole to be able to afford things that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And insurance wouldn't exist if some people paid into it and didn't get value out of it, because that value is going to other people. So the whole point of insurance as a whole is sharing that risk of expense. Same thing goes for medical insurance and healthcare. So if you have insurance, medical insurance, if something goes wrong and you find you have some condition, and you now have to pay thousands of dollars a year to take care of that, what's happening is the money that you spent your whole life up to that point where you found out you had that condition, that money is invested into that health insurance company you've been with, whoever it was, wherever it was. And they're now going to be paying that back. They pay a portion of your health care costs. And all the other individuals who are healthy are paying into that same pool, and that insurance company is using that same pool of money to pay for your healthcare costs. Now, it's not 100%, and it's not, you have to pay a lump sum at the get-go before they'll even start paying a percentage of it. So it's like healthcare isn't perfect, but it still in the end shares the risk of expense. So that's the whole point of insurance. If you have questions on that, I highly recommend you looking it up, because that's a really important and cost to wrap your mind around in the real world, because there's all kinds of insurance. There's house insurance, life insurance, car insurance, health insurance, and if you don't understand the concept behind that, it'll be hard once you get a full-time career kind of job and or working on your own. They're not the company doesn't cover for your healthcare costs, so you're having to purchase those out of pocket with no company sharing that expense. And so it's something to make sure that you have a good foundation of knowledge on. So but for the purpose of this class, we're really talking about health insurance, and we're going to go into more depth with that here in the next couple slides. So first and foremost, federal budget goes a quarter of the federal budget goes to healthcare, and that was a big shocker, and it almost is a big shocker every time I read that, because if you think about how many billions of dollars the federal budget has, and thinking that a quarter, 25% of it goes to healthcare is a lot. And obviously healthcare, you can lump a lot into that kind of category, but it's pretty huge, a huge percentage. So keep that in mind when you hear stuff about budgets and what all it goes into approving an annual or whatever. I don't know, I can't remember quite how often they do it, but every time the budget for the federal government has to be approved, they're looking at that kind of money going towards healthcare, which is why there is a lot of debate when it comes to the budget. There's big chunks going to a lot of different places, and healthcare is one of them. So the next slide here is talking about health insurance in the United States over time. So we saw a huge peak in health insurance, and whenever you have a health insurance growth, it's going to do something to demand, right? It's going to increase that demand for health insurance because there's more health insurance to be had. And it drove up the price because the demand was so high. Health insurance companies were taking advantage of the fact that people wanted it and needed it, and so the prices went up because of that. So, oftentimes that's why health insurance is now a part of businesses. So if you decide to become a full-time worker at a company who offers health insurance in their benefit package, what you see is either high deductible health plans or like non-high deductible health plans. And what that means is that you pay you pay less up front and you get less in return, or you pay more up front and you get more in return for your health care costs. So all in all, businesses can cut down. Oftentimes they pay like 50% or so of what the healthcare costs would be to a person if they would be an entrepreneur, like paying it out of their own pocket. And so that benefit from working for an employer oftentimes is so huge that people stop, either people who are entrepreneurs often have a side job, part-time, somewhere that offers those kind of health insurance benefits just for that purpose alone. The other thing, one thing I learned about that was Cody, my husband Cody, was working night shift through college at FedEx there at the Indianapolis airport. And what they did was he often found a lot of people moonlighting, which is working at night at a separate job that they do during the day, just so that they can have health insurance. Or they just worked that job. They had, they owned an Etsy business or, I don't know, some other business from their home. And the only reason why they had that FedEx night job was for the sole purpose of having them pay for health insurance, because there's not very many people or very many companies out there who give you health insurance for a part-time job, but they were one. And so that was a lot of the times the pull to get people to work even that terrible of a shift, was because they you could get a part-time, but they had benefits. So and they offered other things like stock and FedEx and stuff too, which is of interest to some. So anyway, side note on that front. But health insurance growth, increased cost, and because of the demand went up. So if you have health insurance through a company, then that decreases that cost at least. So moving on. But one thing to note about insurance is something called moral hazard. So once people get insurance, they're like, moral hazard is the kind of thought process that, if I get sick, no big deal. I have health insurance at least. They'll cover part of my cost, no problem. So people who enjoy risky activities have less of a caution in their mind on the risky behavior, because they're like, I have insurance. I'm medically covered. I won't have to pay 100% of the cost. So I am going to choose riskier things. People who drink and get cirrhosis of the liver, and people who smoke and get lung cancers, and the vaping and all this stuff, they, in the back of their mind, they're covered medically, and so they have riskier behavior. So that's called moral hazard. That'll be important for your quiz and tests and things. So remember that one. So moving on to Medicare and Medicaid. Something to note about that is that you might see that at some point in your life. If ever you are in a place where you are you're hard up for money, you might find yourself taking advantage of Medicaid. And what Medicaid is it is health insurance for those who are not financially stable. Either they have had medical issues and can't hold a job because of that, and can't have hold insurance because of that, can't pay for insurance, and so the government will step in and take care of those on disabilities with Medicaid and different things like that. People, low income families and things. That is what the purpose of Medicaid is. So the difference between Medicaid and Medicare is that Medicare really is just for the elderly, and it takes care of only specific elderly care medical costs. So keep in your mind to find a way to remember the difference, because you'll need to know this throughout your life and on the quiz and test. But Medicaid is medical aid. Think of it as medical aid, and I think of those who can't afford it. It's aid for those who can't, don't have the money for it. Now, Medicare is for caring for the elderly, medical care for the elderly. So they're two different purposes, the same idea. They're still providing government-funded medical assistance, but they're for two different categories of people, and they require two different things to be able to apply for them and be granted the either of them. So, moving on. An important historical moment for insurance in the United States was what happened several years ago when Barack Obama was in office. The government passed an Affordable Care Act, which means that every American must have health insurance, or they must pay a penalty for not having that health insurance. What this means is that if you are unable to have health insurance and haven't applied for Medicare or Medicaid, you're taking advantage of everybody who is affording that. And the whole point of it was to ensure that and the government isn't paying for everybody's health insurance just because they haven't signed up for it. So if it's offered, there's a requirement to take the insurance. So whether that's through one spouse or the other spouse or on a joint spouse account kind of thing, but everybody has to have signed up for that. And the whole point of that is so that the government doesn't bear the burden of those who don't have health insurance. And but it has a negative impact. I mean, that has changed the ball game for insurance companies and for the Americans as a whole, I guess. And that those who couldn't really afford it before still can't afford it now. And sometimes it's cheaper to pay the penalty than it would be to pay a monthly premium for health insurance through companies who don't have like a high deductible cheap healthcare option. So you have to choose a lesser of two evils, and some choose just to pay the penalty instead of trying to afford health insurance, in which they couldn't afford anyway. So that's just either way, the government is making money on that policy. I highly encourage you to look up what that really means for our economy and for your future and things. So, and how that might change over time, but. Something to note there about insurance. So moving on from insurance to Social Security. So I'm sure you've heard of Social Security before, and you can kind of ask your parents if what their thoughts are on it. But the point of Social Security is to provide you with a retirement benefit after you have reached a certain age. You can retire at age, 60 to, like 67, and you get certain percent, depending on the year that you decide to retire, you get a certain quantity of a percentage of your Social Security. So the longer you wait, the more you get out of your Social Security benefit. That's to encourage people to work longer and to receive the most benefit that they can at a later date. And as you'll see later on in a couple of different slides, there's some issues with Social Security, and that's also to help ensure that they can pay Social Security out to those who need it, when they need it, when they actually retire. So what's known as FICA, which is Federal Insurance Contribution Act, that allows any company to take out payroll taxes in order to contribute towards Social Security. So that's the act that allowed that to happen. And it's the idea is that once you get to a certain age, you have this benefit. However, because of the baby boom that happened after World War II, there is a large pool of people who are leaving the workforce all at the same time. And what that means is that resource of that Social Security benefit is going to be asked upon, even if the same people who are asking for that have not paid enough into it at the time that they're going to be exiting the workforce. So people are living longer, and so they're paying into that Social Security, but they're still paying, I should say, they're still paying into that Social Security the same amount. So let's say in the 1980s, people were living mostly up until age like 75 was about, as long as they were living. Well, as time has increased and medical care has increased, people are living longer. And so not people who used to live until 75 could now live to 85 or past their 90s. And what that means is that's 15 more years, up to maybe like even, or more, that people are needing or are using that Social Security benefit. So that's that many less thousands of dollars for the people who are just then exiting into retirement or entering into retirement. So that has put some pressure on that pool of resources, and has Social Security, you'll hear in the news that it's facing disaster because people are living longer, the pool of workers are shrinking. How are we going to have enough money in Social Security to be able to give that to those who are retiring when they need it, the year that they need it? So obviously, like I said, one of the tools was they can get a higher benefit the longer they wait to retire. So It's one of the tools I use. But here on the next slide, you'll see some more solutions to that issue. Raising retirement age so that you can't retire until a certain age. You can't get the benefit as one of the solutions that has, they tweak. And another one is determining really how much benefit somebody actually needs to be able to live in retirement, and change that. And obviously somebody living in California is going to cost a lot more than somebody living in Indiana. So what does that mean for, do they change benefits based on location, or all that is something that, the government really has to consider. There's the other options are to lower the amount of benefits that a single individual gets, or let's just say a wife has died and the husband is now getting that Social Security benefit. How, do they shrink that benefit because that person can still work or whatnot? And lowering those benefits helps others but hurts some, and so they have to, figure out the balancing act of that. Government could also increase the payroll taxes so that you are paying more money into Social Security than you have before. So that would cover all that group of people who are retiring at the same time. The other option that they have is to raise the income ceiling above $118,000, so that more those making above that also have to pay more as well. So that's something that you would need to consider. I guess the government is considering all of these options in multiple different ways to be able to figure out what makes the most sense in how they administer Social Security to people who are retiring. So, the next category that we want to talk about is Medicare. And the purpose of it, and the idea is that anybody who is age 65 or older can have medical care coverage for any time they are hospitalized or they have to go to any physician visit. Now, obviously that doesn't cover all medical care costs, but if they have Medicare, they have that option, they have that coverage. So basically it's for people who are retired and don't have a company through which they can get a cheaper rate of medical insurance. So this is their way of continuing medical insurance after retirement, to care for the elderly. So the revenue resources that the government uses to create the Medicare pool of money that people can draw from are payroll taxes, payment premiums, and payments from individual states, and the interest that they have used by creating a trust fund of those funds that they've received, so that Medicare is earning its own interest, and that interest is able to be put back into the pool of money going to those, the elderly, 65 and up. So the money is coming from somewhere, and so they list that out there so that you understand why you are able to tap into that as a resource, why it is available, and how the government is using money, which I think is interesting in the way in which they source the income to be able to provide these kinds of things. So I found that interesting. Since we're nowhere near retirement, it's interesting to think about what that would look like, and or if your grandparents are retiring, or some of you might have older parents, I don't know, but they're in the next 10 or 15 years, your parents might be retiring. This is what it will look like for them. So something for you to think about for on multiple different levels. You might not be there yet, but somebody that would be. So this is what it looks like for them. So moving on from, Medicare and Social Security and insurance, we're moving into a totally different sector here from this unit, and it's energy resources. And the book talks a lot about what the economy is how it's been impacted by different energy resources. And so we're going to touch a little bit on coal and gas and what alternatives to those two that the country has had. So moving all the way back to the Industrial Revolution in the 17 and 1800s, really that was only made possible because of the coal industry. And moving past those 2 centuries, we've, superseded that, and the, petroleum, oil, and gas have really been what has driven the, any mechanized industry forward. So there are a certain number of countries who have oil and gas as a specific natural resources. And there are several of those countries who have that resource have joined a coalition, and it is called OPEC. And I'm sure if you listen to any news at all, you've heard that tossed around. But OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So countries can choose to be in that organization or not. But if they are a part of a standardized pricing is what I would call it. So the organization as a whole, and it'll have a president and a CEO kind of thing, and they'll say, this is what production has been like, and so if we can get these many barrels of oil out, that means that and or if the demand is for oil, barrels of oil is this high, then they can set pricing. And what happens there is that it can become a monopoly or oligopoly or whatever, different, just depending on the situation. And what they do is they control that price because they're an organization. They have colluded to ensure that only a certain number of people can ask for a certain number of barrels for a certain price. So it's very organized. It's not technically organized crime, but that's how they've OPEC. That's their whole point is to ensure that they don't lose money on the oil that they're producing. So the countries that are a part of OPEC include Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. So every time I see those lists, I'm like, oh wait, where is that country? So I encourage you, if you don't know any of those, look them up. Like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, those were ones that are not that familiar to me. Angola was another one. So as you'll note, a lot of those are in the Middle East. The resources are highly sought after resource, and they're very centralized. There are some South American countries too that also have that as a resource. But so that has obviously OPEC prices it has a trickle down effect. Manufacturing requires it, and so you'll often see it's often in the news because the ability for people to make money and or produce things are controlled by OPEC, and so that's why they get so much news time. So moving on from oil and gas and OPEC to what causes the price of gas to fluctuate is really, it comes down to what the supply of oil is. So if OPEC has decided, we're only going to produce 100 barrels of oil per day versus 150, the supply is going to go down and demand will go up. So the cost of that, which means the price, is going to go up. So the cost of the crude oil in and of itself, crude meaning it hasn't been processed and refined. So the cost, moving on down to like refining costs, there are manufacturing facilities that refine that oil, and that costs something. So there's a reason why, these are all the different little things that go into the price of your gas. So not just how much it costs to get it out of the ground, but how much it costs to make oil turn into gas, and how much it costs to get that oil that's been refined into gas into the distribution. And once it's distributed to those states then have an option to tax it. And there's a federal and state tax that goes into that's added to the price of gas per gallon. And then the any other marketing, dealer costs and profits, go into the cost of that gas too. So Shell might have different marketing and dealer costs than Mobil or oh gosh, I can't think of all of the different gas station names, but BP or whatever. So there's all different there's the gas stations fluctuate location to location, not just because of crude oil and distribution, but their individual ways that they market and deal. So you'll find some, gas stations have higher costs than others, and this would be why. So we talked about a little bit about different energy sources. So I want to end that with the alternative energy sources. So wind and solar are the most profitable or common, I guess, maybe, alternative energy sources, but they do rely a lot on government subsidies. So the whole point in that is that you can create a nice infrastructure for yourself as a government if you subsidize the cost that can go into wind and solar power. And the point of doing that is that infrastructure, and that people can rely on their own, and they don't need energy companies to do that for them. So the less reliance you need, the better. So government subsidizes those to make it so that you don't have to lean so much on gas and electric, which electric in the end uses some form of energy like gas or coal. If in the end you're using the electricity's coming, it's coming from somewhere. It's using some sort of energy in the end, and the whole idea is that your footprint of energy is going to be a lot less if the government can subsidize wind and solar. So the reason why they do that, so you don't have to use gas. In the end, the government as a whole uses, I guess the country as a whole would use less gas, and they're less dependent upon countries that are included in OPEC. So there is a pro, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is a subsidy, which in the end you pay for in your taxes and things. So it's something that they have to go back and forth on to make sure it's quite balanced appropriately. So the last slide, or I guess the last two slides, are on automobiles and mortgages. So to finish up this unit, we're going to talk about the automobile industry and how it's changed over time. So in the 20s, Henry Ford's Model T was mass produced, and it was the first of its kind. Henry Ford created mass production, and his model of producing things, and that one person did one thing on a production line, and the next person did that next thing on the production line. Each person only did their individual thing instead of one person creating it from all the way from ground zero up. It was revolutionized the industrial age at the time. So that changed how the industry worked as a whole. If you want to see that in action, the latest Ford versus Ferrari movie is a very good picture of what that looked like in different countries and in different auto industries, and not just like the racing industry as a whole, but beyond that. So highly encourage you to do that if you have any interest in cars and American history, or a good movie that is kind of is a good description of like how that has changed over time. So anyway, recently saw that. It's a good it's not like it's not perfect or anything, but it's interesting at least. So General Motors had at one point had over half of the new car market. So any new car that was produced, half of them were produced by General Motors. So they owned a big chunk of the automobile industry in the United States at one time. However, 1970s hit, price of gas hit the car industry hard because the price of gasoline was so high. Anytime you see gas prices spike, car industry doesn't do that great. People find other means and workarounds to owning cars, or they use them less, which means they don't need them as in a new car as fast, and a lot of different industries are impacted, but new car industry the most. So, but there in 1983, we saw. It was a interesting time in the automotive industry, in that Chrysler came up with the minivan, and that was a totally new innovation that hadn't been, the biggest thing that was out there I think was like a station wagon or something. And so the idea of a minivan, was a whole different kind of car, I guess, and so it created a whole different sector in the industry. So remember that. I think that was on your quiz or test. So just an interesting side note, I guess. But so in the automobile industry, we saw a big movement in who owned how much of the industry. And if I can look at my notes here. Okay, yeah. So the Americans finally had to face the fact that the American cars weren't the only cars out there, and Japan started to become a big competition to the American car manufacturing companies. And it was in the 70s and 80s that Japan really put themselves out there as a leading car manufacturer and took away a good chunk of the business from the United States. So it's interesting, as you'll find that like different countries have different strengths, and how and when they enter into the American market is pretty big. So that happened in the 70s and 80s for Japan for this one. So moving on to the next point here, wanted to mention that I'm sure you've heard this before probably, and that Michigan has there's the big auto titan industries in a bunch of different cities. Most importantly, probably Detroit, and they still are. Cody and I both worked in logistics industry, and a lot of it's a high. I guess the industry that we were in is moves a large percentage of automotive parts, and it still has a good chunk coming from Michigan, in the sense that most of the products, the automotive products, are coming out of Michigan. So, however, that changed. At some point, Michigan fell away as having the most auto-related jobs, and it transitioned at some point to Tennessee. They now have the most auto-related jobs. And one thing that I have found, and I think it was through a college course, an economics college course I took on, I forget what it was called, but I think it was like commercial economics. And it was the professor that taught the class. His job, I don't remember the title of his job, but his role was in the State Department of Indiana, and what he tried to do was find a way to entice companies from the United States and international companies to invest in Indiana's counties, and they would get county tax breaks and state tax breaks if they decided to choose Indiana and selective counties to build their facility on. So one thing I learned in the whole and why I say that in this instance is that there was probably a lot that went into Michigan being secondary now to Tennessee in the most auto-related jobs. They probably had some incentives that they put out there so that they could become and they could have the most auto-related jobs. They must, whether it's cheaper labor, lower taxes, some economic change allowed Tennessee to become what it is now. Something to note in that you'll hear this often throughout your lifetime, the big three. And it has to do with the automobile industry, and they refer to the three biggest American-made car manufacturers, which are GM, which is General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, which Chrysler's now owned by another country, but at the time it was called the big three. So that wraps up the automobile industry and the changes that have happened in it over time. So lastly, we're talking about mortgages. So at some point in your life, you're probably going to own a house, one way or the other. Very few people go their whole life without without buying one. So here's some notes on that, and hope you learned something from it. But the most common type of mortgage is a 30-year fixed interest. So when you sit down with the bank and or a mortgage company, they'll ask you, how many years do you want to be paying off this loan? And you'll tell them like 10 years, 20 years, I think the highest is 30 years. And that's how long you have to pay off your loan. So the longer you have to pay it off, the less the payment is each month. And the less, years that you have, the more it is each month. And your other options that they'll ask you about is what you want your interest to be. So some have a variable interest, like interest will start out low and then it will be the average interest over time or something. But oftentimes people want a fixed interest. They want to know how much interest they're going to pay over the lifetime of the loan. They don't want it to change based on how well the economy is doing. So they want to make sure that they can afford it, and by doing that, they choose fixed interest so that it doesn't change over the life of the loan. 30 years is a long time for the loans to be at if it wasn't fixed. So oftentimes the safest ways that they use to choose is fixed interest. So the only time that's probably not a great of an idea is if you have a lot of money and you know you're going to be paying it off fast. It's riskier to choose the other options, but that's just the most common. So another thing to look at is the amortization table. And you can, I encourage you to ask anybody who you get a loan out with what the amortization table is. And it's the people who are loaning you the money will have this. And what it does is it shows you how much principal versus interest you're paying over the life of the loan. So at the get-go, you're going to be paying more interest than you are in paying off the car itself. And then over time, say halfway through your loan, you might be equal. It might be like you might be paying, say you have $1,000 car payment or something, crazy, or maybe loan payment, I should say, because we're talking about mortgage. And 50%, like $500 of that would be going towards the principal of the loan. So if you got out, took out a $100,000 loan for a home, and you're halfway through, paying off, so you only have $50,000 left on that loan. At that time, you're going to be paying half of the payment that you pay. So if you're paying an annual or a monthly payment of $1,000, 500 of that is going towards the loan, but 500 of that's really going towards the interest, so half and half or something. And then towards the end of the loan, you're paying more of the principal and less of interest because the interest is a percentage, and over time you're paying less percentage on a loan the lower the loan gets. So that's just an idea of what I mean by when I say half and partial and sums. So it will never be like perfect like I'm describing, but that's just to give you a kind of snapshot of what that looks like. So they say that owning a home is better than buying a car. Car depreciates. It will never be this. It will never be at the same or more in car value than it is when you bought it. unless you're talking about a really rare something or other, which no high school student, is going to have, really. So all cars depreciate. So the idea is that your home can appreciate if you add amenities to it. Make it fix up, or your area has developed nicely, or you're in a nice school. You're in an area that has a nice school system or something like that. A lot of times the value of your home can go up just because of that. So many of the government aids for loans have different bunch of different funny names, but one of them is a Fannie Mae loan for a mortgage, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae. And you'll read in your book what those are, but they're just different names of different loans that the government, if you take a government loan out for a mortgage, what that looks like. So there's lots of different mortgages out there, different types. If you're a veteran, there's a VA loan, and that stands for like Veterans Assistance, I think, and it allows you to take a loan out on a home just because you served our country, and it allows you to have no payment down. You can only do that one time in your life, but it gets you a head start, and whatever money you put towards that mortgage, when you sell it, it comes back to you and or the next company if you're going to buy another home. So the idea is that the money that you put towards a mortgage follows you. It either goes towards the cost of your next home, or if you choose not to own a home next, then that's cash that the bank will pay you once, or I guess the person who's buying your home will pay you instead of the place where you initially got your loan out, because you would own it at that point. So something to consider about mortgages is that they can be a source of sort of income in that way. Yep, so that wraps up Unit 13, and I hope you guys have learned something and have a great day. Thank you.